My name is Clara Mensah. I'm 38 years old, and I have spent most of my life being the person in my family who handled everything, gave everything, and was quietly expected to need nothing in return. I want to start by telling you about a dinner, a specific evening that I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count. Not because it was the worst thing that ever happened to me, but because it was the evening someone finally saw what was happening. And that changed everything. I had traveled back to my hometown for the first time in over a year. The drive took 4 hours. I arrived with a bag of gifts, 2 bottles of good wine, and a feeling I can only describe as cautious hope. My parents were hosting a dinner to celebrate my brother Daniel's new job, a mid-level position at a local company. My mother had called it a big step forward for our family. I remember those exact words because I had just closed a 3-country logistics project at work that same week. No one had called that anything. The house smelled of palm oil and fried plantain and the particular warmth of a home that has been cleaned for company. There were about 12 people around the extended table. Relatives, close neighbors, and Mr. Adeyemi, a retired educator in his 60s who had known my family for over 20 years. He was a quiet, thoughtful man, the kind of person who listened before he spoke, which in my experience is rarer than it should be. I helped set the table, and I arranged the drinks. I coordinated with the woman who had been hired to help serve. Nobody noticed. Nobody was supposed to notice. That was simply what I did. The evening moved along pleasantly. Food was passed. Stories were told. Daniel sat comfortably at the center of attention, accepting congratulations with a relaxed smile. I was happy for him. I want to be clear about that. My complicated feelings about my family have never prevented me from genuinely wanting good things for them. That is perhaps the central contradiction of my story. At some point, the conversation moved to education and career choices. A younger cousin was finishing secondary school, and the family was discussing options. I had some relevant experience. I had studied business administration on a full scholarship, had built a career in logistics management, and had spent 7 years navigating a professional world without a single leg up from anyone in that room. I had something useful to say. I leaned forward slightly and began to speak. My mother waved her hand. Not violently. Just a small, dismissive motion, the kind you might use to shoo away an insect. She didn't even look at me fully when she did it. Clara doesn't really have much to say about that, she said. Her voice was pleasant, almost light. She's always been the simple one. Laughter, soft, polite. The kind that says, "We heard it? We're not sure if it was a joke, but it's easier to laugh than to question it." My father said nothing. He reached for the bread. Daniel's mouth curved upward at the corner for just a moment before he looked away. I stopped mid-sentence. I felt the sentence just end, unfinished, somewhere between my throat and the open air. I smiled. I'm not sure why. I think my face did it without my permission. I excused myself and walked to the kitchen. I stood at the sink. I turned on the cold water. I placed both hands flat on the counter and breathed. In the kitchen smelled of dish soap and warm cooking oil. The sounds of the dinner continued from the next room, conversation resuming easily as though nothing had happened, because for them, nothing had. I was not crying. I was something past crying. I was standing very still inside a feeling I had no precise name for. A feeling I'd been carrying for so long it had started to feel like part of my body. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. Mr. Adeyemi was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had followed me quietly. He was not smiling. He was not offering the kind of sympathetic expression that expects you to say you're fine. He looked at me with calm, direct eyes, and he said, "That was not acceptable, and you do not have to pretend it was." I stared at him. In 38 years, no one in that family's world had ever said that to me, not once. I didn't know what to do with it. I nodded. My throat was tight. He didn't wait for me to respond fully. He simply nodded back and returned to the table, and I stood there in the kitchen for another moment, holding onto the edge of the counter, feeling something shift inside me. Not break. Shift. The way a bone realigns, quietly, permanently, and with a dull, significant ache. I want you to understand something before I tell you the full story. What happened that evening was not a single event. It was the surface of something much older and much larger. And to understand why those words from Mr. Adeyemi landed the way they did, you need to understand where I came from. I grew up as the eldest of 3 children. There was me, my brother Daniel, who is 4 years younger, and my sister Amara, who arrived 10 years after me and was treated, by comparison, like a gentle surprise the family hadn't quite prepared for. My parents were both working-class people who cared very deeply about how their family appeared to others. My father spent 30 years as a secondary school administrator. My mother ran a small fabric business from the sitting room of our home. They worked hard. I don't dismiss that. But they also built a household hierarchy that was invisible from the outside and inescapable from within. Daniel was the only son. In our home, that meant something specific and unspoken. It meant his mistakes were explained away. It meant his achievements, however modest, were celebrated loudly. It meant that on the evenings when the family sat together and the conversation turned to the future, Daniel's future was the one being discussed. Amara was the youngest. She was treated with a certain tenderness reserved for those who arrived last and required the least adjustment from everyone else. And then there was me. I was the eldest daughter. In practice, that meant I was staff. I cooked on the evenings my mother was tired. I helped my father sort his school documents on weekends. I sat with Amara during the arguments my parents had behind closed doors, keeping her quiet by reading to her or playing card games until the house went still again. I did all of this without being asked, because I had learned early that being asked meant someone had already waited too long. I anticipated. I filled gaps. I managed. I was never thanked for it. Not formally. Not even casually. It was simply the shape of things. My mother's particular way of speaking to me was comparative. "Why can't you be more like your cousin Adaiz?" she would say. Or, "You think too much, Clara. It's not an attractive quality in a woman." My father was not unkind, but he was emotionally somewhere else, even when he was physically in the room. He praised Daniel for ordinary things, finishing his food, doing average work at school, making his bed. He acknowledged my achievements rarely, and when he did, it was brief and factual, the way you might confirm the weather. And I grew up believing that this was simply how family worked, that daughters carried things, that love was expressed through usefulness, that if you did enough, gave enough, stayed steady enough, you would eventually be seen. I carried that belief into adulthood, and it cost me more than I can fully calculate. Have you ever worked harder than anyone around you and still felt like you were somehow failing to be enough? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Boy, because I know I'm not the only one who has lived inside that feeling. I was 19 years old when I received a full academic scholarship to study business administration at a university 3 hours from home. I came to dinner that evening with the letter in my hand. My heart was beating fast. It was the best thing that had ever happened to me up to that point, and I wanted to share it. My mother read the letter. She looked up. "Does it cover accommodation?" she asked. "Because if it doesn't, I don't know how we'd manage." My father nodded. "We'll have to think about this carefully." I said yes. The accommodation was included. They seemed relieved rather than excited. We ate dinner. The subject moved on. 2 years later, Daniel applied to a technical training program. The fees were modest, not covered by any scholarship. My parents spent 3 weeks making phone calls to aunts, uncles, and family friends to raise the money. When they succeeded, my mother made a special meal to celebrate. She said, "Our son is going to build something with his hands. We should be proud." There was a photograph taken. I was in the background of it. I don't tell you this to build a case. I tell you because I need you to feel the accumulation. One moment alone is nothing, but years of them become the architecture of how you understand yourself. By the time I was 25 and working my first professional position, I'd quietly begun sending money home. Not because anyone sat me down and made a formal request. It happened through a continuous stream of communicated needs. The roof needed a repair. Daniel's school had outstanding fees. My mother's medicine was expensive that month. My father's car had broken down. Each message arrived individually, spaced carefully enough to feel manageable. I gave every time. At a family gathering that year, a relative asked my father how his children were doing. My father talked about Daniel's potential for several minutes, with specific details and genuine warmth. Then he paused and said, "And Clara is in the city. She works in an office." That was the full description. She works in an office. I was sitting 2 seats away. The third moment I want to tell you about happened on a holiday visit when I was 27. I arrived at the house and walked around to the side entrance, which was the shorter path from where I'd parked. And I could hear my mother's voice from the open window. She was speaking with a neighbor. I heard my name. I paused. "Daniel, now that one was raised properly," my mother was saying. "He listens. He respects the family. Clara, she's capable, yes, but she was always difficult to manage." I stood on that step for a long time. The afternoon sun was warm on the back of my neck. A bird was moving in the tree at the edge of the yard. And I stood there, and I held what I had just heard, and I let it settle into the collection of things I had been quietly holding for years. Then I went inside. I called out a greeting. My mother turned and smiled. "You made it," she said. "Are you hungry?" "I'm fine," I said. "Thank you." That is what I did. Every time. I absorbed it and I kept going. Because that was what I had been trained to do. By my mid-30s, I had built a stable life. I was a logistics operations manager at a firm with international accounts. I had a small but clean apartment. I had colleagues who respected my work and a few genuine friendships. I had done all of this alone, with no financial foundation from my family, no professional connections passed to me, no safety net of any kind. What I had built from the ground up. And every month, a portion of what I earned went home. Over 7 years, I tracked it when I finally made myself look. And the number was approximately $97,000. It went toward many things. Daniel's first business failed within 2 years. I helped restart it. My parents had ongoing medical costs as they aged. I covered them consistently. When my parents decided they could no longer fund Amara's secondary schooling, they told me during a phone call that felt more like an announcement than a request. I paid her fees for 3 years. There were home repairs, emergency costs, the things that arrived without warning and were presented with the quiet assumption that I would handle them. I did not give all of this with resentment, at least, not at first. I gave it because that was what love looked like to me. Every time I was close to keeping money for a goal of my own, the phone would ring, and the voice on the other end would describe a need, and I would give. What wore me down, slowly, was not the giving. It was the silence between the needs. My birthday passed without acknowledgement twice in 4 years. When I called to share that I had been promoted to senior manager, the first thing my mother said was, "That's good. Do you think you can help with the electricity bill this month? It's higher than usual." I said yes. I helped with the electricity bill. There is something I need to tell you about, because it is the piece of this story that still sits heaviest. 2 years before the dinner, I had a plan. A real one. When I had consulted with 2 business advisors, I had done the research. I wanted to open a small logistics consultancy of my own, working with small businesses that couldn't afford large firms. I had saved $42,000 over 2 careful years. I had a folder with projections and timelines and the names of potential early clients. I looked at that folder most evenings before I slept. Then, Daniel's second business failed. My mother called on a Tuesday morning. She was crying before I said hello. She said that Daniel was in trouble, that the family was in trouble, that the suppliers were threatening legal action, that they didn't know what to do. She said, "You're the only one who can help us right now, Clara." I transferred $30,000 into the family account 3 days later. Daniel's venture failed again within 4 months. The money was gone. My folder sat on my desk for another year before I moved it to a drawer, then to a box. Then I stopped looking at it altogether. I never told anyone how much that cost me, not just in money, in the specific, particular grief of watching the one thing you had built for yourself be quietly consumed by the same system that had always consumed everything you had. If you've ever sacrificed a dream for someone who never fully understood what it cost you, I think you know that feeling. It doesn't announce itself. It just becomes a quiet heaviness that lives in the back of every ordinary day. Now let me tell you about the dinner, the full evening. The celebration for Daniel's new job was on a Saturday in November. The air was cool and dry when I arrived. I had driven 4 hours. I had brought 2 bottles of wine, a box of pastries from a bakery I knew my mother liked, and a card for Daniel with $50 folded inside. I was tired from the drive, but I was willing. But I reminded myself of that on the way. Be willing, Clara. Be present. I helped set up before guests arrived. I counted chairs, arranged the small decorations my mother had chosen, spoke with the woman hired to help serve, and made sure the drinks were chilled and accessible. My mother moved through the preparations, speaking to the hired help and to my father. She did not say thank you for any of it. That was not unusual. It was simply how things functioned. Guests began arriving around 7. The room filled with conversation and the smell of food and the sound of greetings exchanged with warmth. I made myself useful, refilling glasses, bringing extra napkins, making sure the older relatives had comfortable seats. Mr. Adeyemi arrived close to 8. He greeted me with a firm handshake and asked how I was. I said I was well. He looked at me for a moment longer than the question required, as though he was measuring something, then nodded and moved to find a seat. Dinner was served. The food was good. The conversation was warm. At one point, I mentioned carefully that I had just closed a large project at work, a logistics coordination across 3 countries that had taken 5 months of intensive management. I framed it briefly, not wanting to seem like I was competing with Daniel's evening. My mother looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, then turned to a relative and began a completely different conversation. And it happened so smoothly that for a moment I thought I had imagined speaking at all. Daniel gave a short speech near the end of the meal. He was relaxed and charming. He thanked my parents for their support and said he hoped to make them proud. My father looked at him while he spoke with an expression I had spent my life searching for and never found directed at me. Open, unguarded, pure pride. Then came the conversation about my cousin's career choices. Then my mother's comment. On the wave of the hand, the words, the laughter. I sat for 3 seconds after it happened. 3 full seconds in which my face held a neutral expression entirely independent of anything I was feeling. Then I said, "Excuse me for a moment," and I walked to the kitchen. You know what happened next. Mr. Adeyemi followed. He said what he said, and something in me shifted. I went back to the table. I stayed for the rest of the evening. I helped clean up after the guests left. My mother and I worked side by side in the kitchen, wrapping leftover food and wiping down the counters. She did not mention the comment. She was in good spirits. She asked if I would stay the night. I said I had to drive back. She said to be careful on the road. I said I would. I drove home in complete silence. No radio, no music, just the sound of the road and my own breathing. I walked into my apartment and sat down on the floor of my hallway with my coat still on, and I finally, completely, allowed myself to feel all of it. Not the evening, all of it, every year of it, every moment that had been filed away and managed and breathed through. I sat on that floor for a long time. It was not a pretty moment, but it was, I think now, a necessary one. Because the feeling I had been managing for so long finally had nowhere left to go except fully through me. In the weeks that followed the dinner, I didn't make any dramatic decisions. I didn't call my parents in anger. I didn't draft a letter or plan a confrontation. I simply started looking clearly at things I had been keeping slightly out of focus for years. I sat at my kitchen table one evening with my banking records spread in front of me. I went through 7 years of transfer receipts, one at a time, and I built a spreadsheet. Date, amount, stated purpose. I was precise. I didn't guess or round up. When I finished, I looked at the total. $97,000. I printed the spreadsheet. I set it on the table. I made a cup of tea and I sat across from that piece of paper as though it were a person I needed to have a difficult conversation with. The number was not a surprise, but seeing it printed, organized, complete, was different from holding it loosely in my mind. It had weight. It had years attached to it. It had the business plan that never started. It had birthdays that passed unremarked, while that money moved quietly into an account that was never fully mine. Around that same time, a cousin mentioned during a phone call that my mother had described me recently to a family friend. The description was, the one who helps when she can, not the one who has contributed nearly $100,000 over 7 years, not the one who paid Amara's school fees for 3 years, the one who helps when she can. I want you to think about that phrase for a moment, because the distance between what it implies and what it erases is enormous. I made 2 decisions. The first was quiet and immediate. I stopped all financial transfers. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I simply did not send money that month, or the month after. I waited to see if anyone would ask how I was doing. The first call I received was about a water heater that needed replacing. The second decision was to call Mr. Adeyemi. I'm not entirely sure why I called him first, rather than a friend or a counselor. I think it was because he had been the one to name what he witnessed. And I needed to speak to someone who already knew, without me having to convince them of anything first. We spoke for just over an hour. He listened carefully. He asked a few clarifying questions. He did not tell me what to do. But near the end of the call, he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Clara, a person who has given as much as you have deserves, at minimum, to be known accurately by the people around her." Known accurately. I wrote those 2 words on a piece of paper and set it beside the printed spreadsheet on my kitchen table. And I sat with both of them for several days. Mr. Adeyemi was not a dramatic person. He did not offer me righteous anger or encourage me toward revenge. He was simply a person of steady principles who understood, from decades of watching families and communities, that silence around injustice tends to preserve the injustice rather than protect the people within it. We met in person twice over the following 3 weeks. He came to the city once, and I drove to his neighborhood once. Each time we sat in a quiet place and he asked me questions I had never been asked before. What outcome did I want? Not what outcome would restore peace or satisfy others, but what would allow me to feel that I had honored my own experience. What was I willing to do? What was I not willing to do? I realized through those conversations that I did not want money returned. I did not want a dramatic confrontation or a public shaming. What I wanted was simpler and in some ways harder. I wanted the truth to be known. I wanted the people who had watched my family for years and believed the surface version of our dynamic to understand what was underneath it. Mr. Adeyemi told me, without pressure, that my parents' 40th wedding anniversary celebration was being planned for the following month. Most of the extended family would attend. Family friends who had known all of us for decades would be present. He said it simply, and then he stopped speaking. He also gently suggested I speak with a counselor. He framed it as a practical matter, not a clinical one. "You've been managing a great deal alone for a long time," he said. "Carrying something with someone else present is different from carrying it alone." I made an appointment that week, then another. My counselor was a calm woman in her 50s, named Dr. Ose Bonsu. In our second session, she said something that reorganized something inside me. She said I had been living inside an invisible debt system. The belief, instilled early and reinforced continuously, that love is something you earn through sacrifice rather than something you receive simply for being present. Naming it didn't fix it immediately, but naming it made it visible, and visible things can be addressed. I left those sessions slightly lighter each time, not healed, moving in that direction. The anniversary celebration was held at a rented community hall about 20 minutes from my parents' home. I arrived early. I told myself I arrived early because I wanted to help. And that was partly true. I also wanted to be inside the room before it filled, to feel grounded before the noise began. I helped arrange flowers along the front tables, long-stemmed white and yellow arrangements in low vases. The hall smelled of fresh linen and the warm catering trays being set up in the side room. About 50 people filled the space over the next hour. Relatives I had not seen in years. Neighbors, church friends, family friends, including Mr. Adeyemi, who arrived midway through and took a seat near the back, with a small nod in my direction. The evening moved through its organized sequence: speeches from the pastor, a tribute video, photographs passed around tables. My parents sat at the front, my mother in a deep burgundy dress, my father in a suit that he wore with evident pride. They looked genuinely happy. I watched them and felt the complicated mixture of love and grief that has been my particular relationship with them for most of my adult life. Then came the time for family tributes. Daniel stood up. He was composed and warm. He spoke about how much his parents had sacrificed, how their belief in him had shaped his confidence, how he hoped to honor them. The room applauded. My father's eyes were bright. My mother pressed her hand to her chest. Then the host said, "And now, again a few words from Clara." My mother turned toward me with the expression of someone who expected 3 polite sentences and a return to her seat. I stood up. The room was warm and full of the sound of 50 people settling into listening. I held my notes, though I didn't look at them much. My voice was steady. It did not tremble. I had not expected it to be that steady, but it was. "Thank you all for being here," I said. "My parents have built something real over 40 years. And this room is proof of that. I mean that sincerely." I paused. "I also want to share something honest, because I think honesty is one of the more genuine ways to honor a long life together." I saw my mother's expression change. Just slightly. The anticipation in it shifted into something more careful. Over the past 7 years, I have contributed approximately $97,000 to my family. For medical costs, for educational expenses, for emergency repairs, and for my brother's business needs. I gave this money willingly. I was raised to believe that family support was a form of love, and I still believe that. I would do portions of it again. The room was very quiet now. What I also want to say, in this room, with the people who have known my family for many years, is this. I have spent most of my life being told, in ways both small and significant, that I was less capable, less important, and less deserving of recognition than my brother. I was described recently as someone who helps when she can. I would like the people in this room to know the full truth of what I have contributed and what I have endured. Not for sympathy and not to harm anyone, but because I am no longer willing to pretend those things did not happen. I sat down. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Long, full seconds. Then a murmur began. The particular low sound of a room processing something it was not prepared for. My mother's face was composed in the careful way of a person working very hard to appear composed. My father stared at the table. Daniel looked somewhere past the room, at nothing in particular. Near the back of the hall, Mr. Adeyemi looked at me. He gave a single, slow nod. Nothing more. It was enough. The days that followed were not easy. I want to be clear about that, because sometimes stories like this make the aftermath sound cleaner than it is. My mother called 3 times in 2 days. Each call was a variation on the same position. I had embarrassed the family. I had exaggerated. I had chosen a public occasion to cause damage when I should have come to them privately. On the 3rd call, I listened to everything she said. When she finished, I said, "Mom, I understand that you're upset. I hope when things are calmer, we can have a real conversation." Then I said goodbye and ended the call. She called back immediately. I did not answer. My father called once, 2 days after my mother's 3rd attempt. His voice was quieter than I had heard it in years. He didn't build an argument. He asked how I was doing. Then he said, "You've always worked hard, Clara." He paused after that, the pause of a man who had more to say and had not yet found the language for it. He said he hoped I was taking care of myself. I said I was. The call lasted 4 minutes. It held more real conversation than most of the calls we had shared over the previous decade. Daniel sent a message. 2 lines. He said I had no right to bring money into a family occasion. I read it twice. I did not reply. I set the phone face down on the table and went back to what I had been doing. But other things happened too. 2 aunts contacted me within the week. Both independently, neither aware the other had reached out. One said she had no idea of the scale of what I had been contributing. She said she was proud of me. The other said she was sorry the family had never named it properly. A woman named Mrs. Folick, who had known our family since I was a child, and who I always remembered as someone with careful, observant eyes, sent me a message that was several paragraphs long. She said she had always noticed how I was treated differently. She said she regretted not speaking sooner. She said speaking the truth, even when it costs something, was a form of dignity. She hoped I knew that. I read her message 3 times. My full salary went into my own account that month. Only my account. No transfer was made, for the first time in 7 years. I sat with my banking app open and looked at the balance as though I was meeting it for the first time. Then I opened a new savings account, named it simply with my own initials, and deposited the first amount toward the business plan I had placed in a box and stopped looking at. The number was modest, but it was entirely mine. I held my phone and looked at it for a while, and I felt something that I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like I was moving forward in my own life, not my family's life, mine. I want to be honest with you about where I am now, because this is not a story with a clean ending. I am not fully healed. I say that plainly and without apology, because healing is not a place you arrive at after the brave moment. It is a practice, a daily, sometimes boring, sometimes difficult practice of making choices that treat your own life as something worth caring for. I continued seeing Dr. Osei for several months. Those sessions helped me understand things about myself that I could not have seen alone. The specific way I had been trained to prioritize others' comfort over my own needs, the guilt I felt when I kept money for myself, and the deep uncertainty I carried about whether I deserved good things simply because I existed and not because I had earned them through sacrifice. We worked through these things slowly. Some of them I am still working through. My savings grew month by month. By the end of the year, I had rebuilt enough to move the business plan from its box back to my desk. I called one of the advisors I had spoken to 2 years earlier. I explained where I was. We began again. I hired a part-time consultant, a young woman named Afua who was sharp and organized and reminded me a little of myself at that age. I registered the company, my name, alone, on the registration document. I chose a name that meant something personal to me, nothing grand or clever, just something that felt like mine. My relationship with my parents did not return to what it was before the dinner. It has become something different, more honest, more boundaried. My father and I speak occasionally, on Sunday afternoons mostly. The conversations are simple but real. He asks about work. I ask about his health. He said once, without being prompted, that he should have paid more attention. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask him to. It was enough. My mother and I are finding our way. She is a proud woman who does not apologize easily and may never apologize fully for what she said or what she allowed over the years. I have made peace with that, not because it was acceptable, but because waiting for an apology that may never come is its own kind of imprisonment. I choose not to stay imprisoned. Amara and I are closer now than we have ever been. She called me 3 weeks after the anniversary and said carefully that she had always known things were uneven. She said she was sorry she had never said it before. We talked for over an hour. That conversation was one of the unexpected gifts of everything that had happened. Daniel and I have not spoken since his message. I am open to that changing when he is ready for it to change. I am not waiting. If this story has reached something in you, I want you to hear this next part directly. I'm not speaking to you as someone who has all the answers. I'm speaking as someone who spent nearly 4 decades being the person everyone leaned on and no one truly saw. The people who are never protected are often the very best at protecting others. That is not an accident. It is a pattern. And it is learned early, or in the small moments of childhood when a parent's expression tells you that your needs are less urgent than your usefulness, when your achievements are met with good, now can you help with, before the sentence has fully finished. When you are praised for your strength so consistently that you begin to believe that needing anything at all is a form of weakness. If you recognize yourself in any part of this story, I want to ask you something. Not rhetorically, genuinely. When was the last time someone asked what you want? Not what you can give, not what you can manage, what you want for your own life. If the answer is that you can't remember, please sit with that for a moment, because that gap is worth paying attention to. Leave a comment and tell me, because I believe these stories matter when we share them. I registered my business on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I drove to the government registration office alone. I had dressed simply but carefully. I carried the documents in a folder I had organized the night before. I sat in a waiting room that smelled of old paper and recycled air, the kind of institutional quiet that feels both tedious and oddly significant. When my number was called, I walked to the desk. I answered the questions. I signed the paperwork. The clerk stamped the document and handed it back. She was already looking toward the next person before I had fully taken it from her hand. I walked out into the street, where the morning was sharp and clear, not dramatically beautiful, just ordinary daylight on an ordinary street. I stood on the pavement for a moment, holding my registration folder, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph. Something quieter and more durable than that. Presence. I was fully present in my own life, in a way I had not been, perhaps ever, before. I walked to my car. I sat for a moment before starting the engine. I thought about the kitchen in my parents' house, and the running water and the feeling of my hands flat on the counter. I thought about Mr. Adeyemi standing in that doorway. I thought about the words he said, how simple they were, and how long they took to arrive in my life. The guest who changed everything didn't give me anything new. He simply helped me see what I had been carrying all along, and reminded me that I was allowed to set it down,